Welcome to Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm Senior Religion Reporter Peggy Fletcher-Stack. Joining me is Senior Managing Editor David Noyce, who oversees our faith coverage. Hi, Dave.
Hello, Peggy.
He's coming to us from Chicago.
Right.
Before we start, we remind you about another way to support Mormon Land. Just go to patreon.com, where, with a donation as small as $3 a month, you can access transcripts to our podcasts, our complete newsletter, and all our religion coverage. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/MormonLand. And if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram at mormon.land. Now for today's episode. To many liberal members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Apostle Hugh B. Brown was an ecclesiastical icon, a fierce warrior for social justice, and a passionate proponent of ending the faith's former temple priesthood exclusion of Black members. Still, Brown was not without his critics, including some strong opponents among the church's highest leadership ranks. As a member of the governing First Presidency from 1961 to 1970, for example, Brown wrangled with future church presidents Harold B. Lee and Ezra Taft Benson, as well as other apostles. Quote, "For a generation of Latter-day Saints, he represented the kind of pulpit magic associated with names like Orson F. Whitney, Brigham H. Roberts, Melvin J. Ballard from an earlier day," wrote scholar Richard D. Paul in Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. For thousands of individuals with questions and problems, he represented the kind of understanding and counsel associated earlier with John A. Widtsoe, James E. Talmage, and Joseph F. Merrill. To Paul and many others who knew him personally, he wrote, Brown, quote, "was a multifaceted, magnificent human being." Yet he eventually was dropped from the First Presidency and spent his final years in some sorrow. Joining us remotely to explain some of the controversies Brown faced is Matthew Harris, a history professor at Colorado State University, Pueblo, and author of, quote, of Second Class Saints, Black Mormons and the Struggle for Racial Equality, who is currently working on a biography of Hugh B. Brown. Matt, welcome.
Hey, Peggy. Hey, Dave. Nice to be here today.
All right, give our listeners a brief summary of Brown's life before entering church service. What stood out about him in those years?
Well, he was born in the Salt Lake Territory in 1886, and when he was a teenager, they moved to Western Canada, which is what defined him, essentially. He always called himself a Canadian as opposed to an American. But the truth is that he had two feet in both countries and spent most of his adult life in the United States, but always went back to visit family periodically. And he was a dabbler in a lot of things. He would be a lawyer at one point in his life. He'd be a businessman. He was a cattle rancher. And he grew up in a large family. He was exposed to general authorities through the years. In those days, they would stay, with church members as opposed to the Marriott Hotel today. And anyway, so he got to meet a lot of church leaders that way. And I'm certain we'll talk about this in a minute. But when he was a young boy, he was at a church service, and Apostle Heber J. Grant visited this Canadian ward of his. And he prophesied, Elder Grant, Apostle Grant, prophesied that one among them would be an apostle one day, just like him. And Hugh B's, I think, 15 years of age, and who knows what he's thinking about in the ward when he hears this, probably things that 15-year-olds think about. But afterwards, his mother, Lydia Brown, told Hugh, said, "He's talking about you." And then later, the bishop of the ward approached young Hugh B and said, "He's talking about you. And this honor and this privilege can be yours if you live a worthy and righteous life." And Hugh B always had that prophecy etched in the back of his mind.
So even though that was his destiny, supposedly, he was not called into the Quorum of the 12 till he was well into his 70s. Why not?
Yeah, so when he was on his mission in 1904, his mission president was, drum roll, Heber J. Grant, the same apostle who made the prophecy. And President Grant, who's still an apostle at this point, made that prophecy again to the missionaries. So Hugh's now heard it, a couple of 3 times. And in the 1920s, this is after Hugh B married a woman named Zina Card, who was the granddaughter of Brigham Young. But in the 1920s, as he's a young man, his life is taking off. He's having children, getting ensconced in his career. Hugh B's mother, Lydia, writes President Grant, who's now the church president, and says, "Now remember that prophecy you made about my boy." he's made some pretty good decisions in his life. Hint, hint, wink, wink. So anyway, that's in the 1922. She writes that letter, and it's really a funny letter to read with this context in mind, because Hugh B's in his early 30s by this point. So the question is that you asked, Peggy, what happens? And in the early 1930s, prohibition has been repealed in the state of Utah. Utah, as some of your listeners may know, was a decisive state in this enterprise. And the church leaders told the Utahns, don't support the repeal of it. And, Utahns do their own thing, and they did it anyway. And anyway, so there was a liquor commission that the church wanted to have a pulse on. And the commission, it's a 3-man commission, and their task was to dole out liquor licenses after prohibition's repeal. So when businesses applied for a liquor license to sell liquor, that the commission would review it. And the idea would be that they wanted to limit and control the number of folks who could sell liquor. That's really what it was. And Zina Brown, Hugh's wife, said, "Don't you do it. It's going to bite you. Don't you do it. People are going to be angry, when they get denied their liquor right, their ability to make money." But Hugh B tells his wife, he said, "Look, President Grant asked me to chair this commission, and I'm going to honor the wishes of the church president." And so he does. He essentially follows the guidance of his church leader over that of his wife. And just like Zina predicted, it came back to bite him in the butt, because several people started to accuse Hugh B and his 2 fellow commissioners of taking bribes to the businesses that got the liquor licenses. And so they do investigation, and they found that Hugh and his 2 associates were innocent of the bribery charges, but perception's often reality. And David O. McKay, who was in the first presidency at the time, this is a fascinating story. Hugh B and David O never really got along that well. 2 really strong-willed, charismatic, handsome, charming leaders, just sort of competitors, if you will. But anyway, President McKay, as the first presidency counselor, showed up to Hugh B's stake, the Granite Stake in Salt Lake, where Hugh B was the stake president, a beloved stake president, effective leader, and abruptly released him as the stake president. Hugh B had no idea it was coming. And it was because of the liquor debacle. And they also released him from the board of directors at the LDS Business College. And Hugh B was just, you can imagine, right? He's crushed because he's been told that he'll be an apostle. And so he's so upset that he has to leave Salt Lake. They not only get released, but they move out of Salt Lake to Glendale, California. And the brethren realize that, we probably treated him a little badly. We asked him to do this, and this is what happens, and this is how we treat him. So they called him to be a mission president shortly after he was trying to reconstruct his life in California. And let me just say this quick thought is 1931, just a couple of years before this liquor scandal erupted, Hugh B was second in line for an apostleship. And the person who got in 1933, I think, is what I meant to say. But J. Reuben Clark got the nod that year, and Hugh B came in second. Not that it's a vote, but in President Grant's diaries, he says that Clark was my number 1 pick and Hugh B was my number 2 pick. And then the liquor debacle happened. And then his good friend and fellow stake president in Salt Lake during the Great Depression, a guy named Harold Lee, was called into the quorum himself in 1941. He really pushed for Hugh B to be called into the general authority ranks. And in 1953, this is about 13 or 14 years after the liquor scandal, sort of in the distant past, Harold Lee nudges, not just Elder Lee, but some others as well. They convinced President McKay to call Hugh B. Brown into the general authority ranks. But he's called as an assistant to the Quorum of the 12, not the full quorum itself. And on the one hand, Hugh B. is elated that he's regained the brethren's trust. But on the other hand, that wasn't the prophecy that was made to him as a young man. And as his biographer, I conclude that this is President McKay, who's now the church president. This is his way of saying, all right, let's see if you can prove yourself. And so this is 53. Elder Brown is an assistant to the Quorum of the 12 for 5 years. And just shy of his 78th birthday, he gets elevated into the Quorum of the 12 itself.
So, Matt, Hugh B. Brown had kind of a commanding presence at the pulpit, too. Became a popular speaker. In fact, 2 of his sermons, Profile of a Prophet and God is the Gardener, still circulate among members today. What were your impressions of him as a speaker?
When I was growing up, I heard stories. I grew up in Maine, and I heard frequent stories about my father's interaction with Hugh B. Brown when Hugh B. Brown spoke to my father's mission in New England in 1963. My dad's mission president, Peggy will know this name well, and because of her family connection, but my dad's mission president was Truman Madsen, who was the grandson of Heber J. Grant. And just a backstory on how Brown got to visit Madsen's mission. He was going back to Boston to visit his daughter and his son-in-law who lived in the area at the time. And he called up Madsen, with whom he knew well. And he said, hey, I'm in town. Do you want me to speak to your mission? I mean, what's Madsen going to say? Nah, we're busy. And so President Madsen, of course, was delighted to get a member of the First Presidency to speak to his mission. So they rent a Boston Music Hall. They invite hundreds of people, converts, members. They're all there. And that was my dad's first introduction to seeing Hugh B. Brown up close and personal. And in my dad's recollection, he talked about, when President Brown came out, he took out his comb and was combing his beautiful white hair. And he made a prophecy to the missionaries. I should say this is after the general meeting with the investigators. He spoke to the missionaries. And he made a prophecy to the missionaries that one among them would be an apostle one day. And that always stuck with my dad. But I read the transcript of that talk, Dave, and I was, everything that makes him a powerful speaker is on full display. His humor, the depth of his thinking, his ability to connect with people. So I read that and I was moved by reading the transcript. And then later at the church archives, I listened to an archived audio version, and it just gave me chills down my spine. Even today, when I'm out walking, I don't really listen to podcasts a whole lot. I shouldn't confess that, should I? But I'm out walking and I listen to these sermons because I really want to get the feel and the flavor for them as speakers. And every time I listen to Brown, he's got a gift to speak. And I would argue that Brown is probably one of the best, if not the best, orator in the church in the 20th century. Maybe B.H. Roberts might give him a run for his money, but Hugh B. Brown has a gift. One of the Brown family members told me something interesting that I'm trying to nail down. And that is that in the 1930s, Hugh B. Brown was part of the Democratic Party politics in Utah. He was the chairman of the party. And as such, he got to know the National Democratic Party chairman, a guy named Jim Farley, who was very close with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the Brown family lore is that when FDR heard Hugh B. Brown give a speech back in the 1930s, FDR allegedly said that he's heard 2 great orators in his life. One was Winston Churchill and the other one was Hugh B. Brown. And I want that story to be true so badly.
Wow. Yeah.
And I can believe it. Really, I can believe it because Hugh B. was a powerful speaker.
Okay, let's talk briefly about his, let's say sometimes thorny relationships with high-profile church leaders. He was put in the first presidency with David O. McKay, for instance, but their ties were strained and soured. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so as I mentioned a minute ago, these are 2 high-profile leaders. They're handsome men. They're charming. They're people respect their authority. And what happens with Hugh B. Brown and David O. McKay, it's an interesting story. In many ways, it's a tragic story because they started off on the wrong foot. President McKay was bothered by the liquor scandal, even though President Grant asked him to do it. McKay unceremoniously released him as the stake president, which really crushed his spirits. And then President McKay called him in to be an assistant to the Quorum of the 12 in 1953. And he won President McKay's favor by working very diligently on his high profile assignment that the president asked him to do, which is to look at temple cancellation sealings when couples were going to apply for a temple divorce. These are rituals in Latter-day Saint temples. That means that you would be with your spouse in the hereafter, not just in mortality. So it's a sacred Mormon ritual, and when these rituals were broken, either from divorce or even death, that it required somebody like Hugh B. Brown on assignment to the church president to evaluate each case and to recommend to the president whether the sealing should be broken or not. And Hugh B. Brown demonstrated such prowess and thoughtfulness and exhaustive in his research. And his son later bragged that President McKay never overturned my father once in his recommendations. Well, anyway, so that was one thing that brought Hugh B. close to President McKay, is the stellar work that he did there. The second thing that he did was that, so that's what got him called into the 12, is that closeness that they both had. That's the short answer. And by 1958, when he was called into the 12, he embarked on a second critical assignment, and that is that there were some missionaries in France who were practicing or teaching this idea of plural marriage. I mean, imagine this, 19, 20-year-old young men telling their mission president, telling local bishops, telling the people that they're teaching, our church got it wrong on polygamy. There never should have been any manifestos. And I mean, that's what they're doing. And they fell under the sway of an older missionary named Bill Tucker, who was a graduate of UCLA. He was 23 years of age. So these younger missionaries looked at this older, charming, eloquent, articulate missionary, and he's the one that was teaching it. He was the ringleader. Well, President McKay got word what was going on, that there were some rogue missionaries. And so he sent young Hugh B, who was newly named as an apostle, to go figure out who the ringleader was and what's going on. So Hugh B finds out that it's Tucker, and he interrogates him much as a lawyer would a client. I mean, he puts him right under oath, if you will. Asks him these tough questions. Do you believe that David O. McKay is a prophet? Nope. Do you believe that the church erred in the manifestos ending polygamy? Yep. I mean, that's how it was. The guy was defiant to the bitter end. And Hugh B. Brown would then ask other missionaries, who else is involved in this? And they were mum. They wouldn't say. They made an oath to Tucker not to reveal. And finally, there was a sister missionary that cracked, and she named names. At first, she wouldn't say a word to Elder Brown, but she cracked. She named the names. They excommunicated 9 of these missionaries. And I should say that this occurred just before the rededication of the temple in London. And so the brethren were in town for the temple dedication, including President McKay. And after this ordeal of these interviews and all of this, Elder Brown would go to President McKay's hotel room that night in England and say, look, this is what happened today. This Tucker guy, he wouldn't crack. He's arrogant, all of this stuff. And that experience brought both of these men together. And it wasn't until 2.5 years later where President McKay needed an additional counselor in the first presidency. J. Reuben Clark, his first counselor, and Henry Moyle, his second counselor. They had health issues, and there were some other issues going on. So he called in Hugh B to be his counselor in 1961 after only being in the Quorum of the 12 for 3 years. And President Brown's children attribute his rapid rise in church leadership to the fact that President McKay won his trust. Or I should say, Hugh B won President McKay's trust with his stellar work dealing with these French missionaries. And the last thing I'll say is on this is that it's a tragic story because they were very, very close during the early years of President Brown's first presidency tenure. But by 1965, up until President McKay died in January 1970, The president was on the outs with Hugh B. Brown and also Eldon Tanner. They just had differences of leadership, differences about decision making. And when President Brown spoke at President McKay's funeral in January of 1970, it was really, really strained. But President Brown said something really, really insightful, which was, I wouldn't be the man that I am today without David O. McKay giving me a chance. And I'm sure the people who heard that, the saints who heard that, had no idea what that means, giving me a chance. The brethren in the room knew what that meant. He's referring to the liquor debacle, and he's referring to, after all these years, here's a man into his 70s who's finally called into the general authority ranks. That was the chance for which Hugh B had craved, and the president gave it to him, and Hugh B never forgot about that.
Mormon Land will be right back. So let's talk about another guy you've already mentioned, Harold B. Lee. Talk about their ups and downs.
Oh, man. Another interesting story. Oh, so Harold B. Lee. So it goes back to when they were stake presidents together in the stake presidency. Harold B. Lee was this dashing, young, brilliant administrator. He's sort of the mastermind behind the church's welfare program. It's sort of a pilot case for his stake that later gets adopted writ large for the church. Reuben Clark recognized, as the first presidency counselor, Clark recognized that Lee was onto something. And Hugh B copied some of Lee's ideas about church welfare during the Depression and also applied it to his stake in the Granite Stake. So they were very close friends. When Hugh B's son died in World War II, his plane did a routine mission and never came up again, lost him at sea, essentially, is what they thought happened. Harold Lee is the first person that reached out to Brown and just expressed this incredible heartfelt letter about the loss of his son. So they were very close. And the first thing that when Hugh B was called in to be an assistant to the Quorum of the 12 in 1953, Elder Lee went to President McKay and he said, I want him to speak with me. He'll be my junior companion, even though Hugh B was older. So there's great respect. And by the 1960s, there's a couple of three things that happen that really lead them to fall out. And one is that Hugh B is actively pushing to end the priesthood ban. And he's talking to reporters. I've written about this at Send Class Saints in great detail. But he's talking to reporters and trying to put pressure, the press to put pressure on the brethren to lift the ban. And of course, Elder Lee is he's a rock-ribbed institutionalist. This is not what one does. And so there's tension there, there's strain there. The other strain is that Elder Lee is the mastermind behind correlation in the 1960s. Now, correlation's been talked about since the 1930s, about correlating the church's programs, having the same doctrinal message around the world, having the same manuals. But what that means is that the young women's and the young men's and the Relief Society and all the different journals are now going to come under one head. And they're going to lose their autonomy and their independence that they had once enjoyed. Elder Lee's really pushing for this. And Hugh B pushes back. He says this is wrong. They need their independence. And secondly, if there is going to be a controlled, coordinated effort from Salt Lake, it's going to come from us, the first presidency, not from the 12. And so President Brown thought his old friend was on a power grab. And so that's kind of an unfortunate thing. So in 1969, President Brown is pushing again to end the ban. And Elder Lee is just furious with him on this. And Elder Lee is the one that tells Joseph Fielding Smith, when he's put in as the next prophet, he tells President Smith, you can't retain him as the counselor. It's got to be me. And so Brown is furious that Lee pushes him out of the first presidency. The Brown family, they're bitter about it. Papa Brown, Hugh B, and Zina are bitter about it. I mean, I don't use that word lightly. Bitter is the word they use in their diaries and their private letters. So they attribute Harold Lee pushing this incredible, well-respected church leader out, and he's depressed. And there's a happy part of this story, unlike President McKay, who dies in 1970 with the rift with Brown intact. There's a happy part of the story with Lee. Lee recognizes that this beloved leader, this leader whose sermons like the currant bush or God is the gardener and Profile of a Prophet. I mean, he's just beloved. He's an incredible speaker. Lee recognizes that he was pushed out. He wasn't even recognized in the April 1970 General Conference for his service. It was just that he got released and he's going back into the 12. And the family was also upset by that. Anyway, so the happy part of this is that Hugh B sees them in a dream after President Lee dies. And he sees them in a dream in which Harold Lee appears to him, and they basically hug it out. And this is a moment in which Brown recognizes he needs to reconcile with his former friend. And just tell you one quick story, if I may, that when they dedicated the Washington, D.C. temple in November of 1974, Hugh B was he just turned 90, and he was in no position to travel. But the Saints needed him there. They wanted him there. President Kimball convinced him to go. They were at the temple, this newly built temple, and they were in the elevator. And Hugh B was in his wheelchair. His son Charles was pushing the wheelchair. Brown's physician was right there, a guy named Russell Nelson. Your listeners will know. And as the doors open, Joan Lee walks in, Harold Lee's widow. And Hugh B looks at her and he says, "I saw Harold last night. He looked really well." And all of a sudden, Charles pushes the wheelchair out and the doors close. You can imagine that Joan Lee's in the elevator thinking to herself, what just happened? And they never were able to reconnect at this busy temple dedication. Charles later explained details about that reunion that Hugh B had with his old friend Harold Lee. So they do make up, but it's a really fascinating story of their relationship.
So Matt, we had you on before when you wrote about Ezra Taft Benson, of course, and it seems likely that there would be clashes between Ezra Taft Benson and Hugh B. Brown, politically, if nothing else, right? Could you talk just briefly about what their battles were like?
Yeah, I think so. Elder Benson was a strong-willed partisan, just like Elder Brown was. Let's be clear. But the difference between the two men is Elder Benson felt the need to push his views on the church. I say this respectfully, but that's what he does. His biographer, a guy named Francis Gibbons, Desert Book published this back in the 90s, but his biographer said that there was seldom a sermon in which he gave in the 60s in which he didn't talk about politics. And that's in part one of the reasons why Elder Benson was so controversial. It wasn't just that he was always talking about politics, but he was saying abrasive things like, if you believe in civil rights, you're an apostasy. If you're a liberal, you're really a communist.
You can't be a Democrat and a good Mormon.
You can't be a Democrat and a good Latter-day Saint. And, people are asking Hugh B about this, and he's like, that's interesting. I'm in the first presidency, and the brethren haven't saw fit to cut me off yet. But it really spoke to a deeper issue that Elder Benson's partisanship is really, really harming the church. And President Brown, who's in the first presidency, feels this. Brown used to tell a story, sometimes in jest, sometimes not, in which he was at Temple Square, and the Temple Square person giving a tour was asked, can you be a good Democrat and a good Mormon? And the Temple Square visitor, a devotee of Elder Benson, said, no, you can't. And then the response was, what about President Brown? What about him? He's not a very good Mormon. And so, this is a tour, and it gets back to Hugh B, that this is what's being said. So, and then Elder Benson's linkage with the John Birch Society, this extreme anti-communist organization, puts everything over the top. And Elder Benson, so what happened with Brown is he would see what Elder Benson's doing, and he would, Brown would fight back both in public and in private. He wasn't really saying you need to be a good Democrat, a good liberal, and all of that. People who knew him knew that those were his values. But he was always taking jabs at Elder Benson in public. And one day in the late 60s, Harold B. Lee was returning from a church assignment in Chicago. And it just so happened he was sitting next to a church employee he'd never met before. And he turns to the church employee and he says, if I'm ever in charge, the first thing I'm going to do is sit Harold Lee and sit Hugh Brown and Ezra Benson down, and I'm going to tell them to cease their political talk or you won't be in the church. You can imagine the church employee is like, wasn't expecting this. But that's, it was causing divisions in the leadership. And in 1974, just before Hugh B died, his old missionary who was with him in England back in the 30s, a guy named Marvin J. Ashton, who would later become a member of the Quorum of the 12. Actually, he was a member of the Quorum of the 12 when he interviewed his old mission president in 1974. But Elder Ashton asked Hugh B, he said, is there anything you want to say about the church today or the Quorum of the 12 today? And he said, without even flinching, he said, we need unity. And that was his way of saying that, Benson's in his partisanship is really harming the unity of the church. And I think in a moment of self-reflection, I think he thought that he was partly responsible for that disunity too, because he always spoke his mind when he should have been at times more circumspect.
So you have mentioned in public speeches that Hugh B. Brown's daughter was once married to polygamist Rowland Jeffs, who was the father of the even more infamous Warren Jeffs, who was in prison for child sexual assault. Tell us how that happened and how did he get her out of that marriage?
Oh, man, that's a little known story because you can imagine that the Brown family was embarrassed by it. And I mean, here you have a high ranking person. Hugh B. Brown would have been a mission president at this point. So Hugh B's in England as a mission president, and he receives word that his daughter, Zola Jeffs, the mother of his two grandchildren, married to a guy named Rowland Jeffs, who was good friends with Gordon Hinckley when they went to high school, was friends of the Brown family, this really charming, articulate young man. The Brown family loved him. Anyway, Hugh B got word in England that Rowland Jeffs was going to take a plural wife. And Rowland's father, David Jeffs, got wrapped up in this. He was one of we would call him a fundamentalist today. He was one of the ones that didn't think the church ought to give up this divine law, didn't believe in the sanctity of the manifestos, plural manifestos, 1890, 1904, and 1933. There are three manifestos in which the church is trying to slowly move away from its polygamous past. Well, David Jeffs didn't do it, took a plural wife, convinced his son that he needed to take a plural wife. And Rowland has a vision and he sees in his vision this woman in Provo that's to be his second wife. And he tells Zola about it. And Zola, of course, is crushed, doesn't want to share her husband, to put it crassly. And anyway, convinces her that this is what God wants. And when Hugh B, when word gets back to Hugh B about that this is going down, he flies home from England unannounced and shows up in his daughter and son-in-law's house in Salt Lake. And he basically tells Rowland, he says, look, if you want to stay married to my daughter, these are the 5 things you have to do. And he lists 5 things. You can't go to any more polygamous meetings. You can't give them any of your money. You can't read their literature. If you see your father, you have to bring Zola. So he names all these things. And Zola's just crying in the corner, sobbing uncontrollably because she knows her father's right, but yet she loves her husband. Well, anyway, a few years after that encounter, they finally petitioned for divorce. Hugh B works some of his connections. He's in the legal field. He knows judges. And he orchestrates his daughter's divorce. And Zola is crushed that this is ended. And just to say one last thing about this tragic story is that about a year after the divorce, when Zola is in this profound melancholy, Hugh B goes to Rowland Jeffs when he was at work. He's an accountant, goes to his accounting business, doesn't tell his wife Zina, doesn't tell Zola. And he tells Rowland, he says, you've got to take my daughter back. You've got to be a father to those 2 kids. And you've got to repent of your sins and be worthy to remarry my daughter. And Rowland says, I had a vision from God and I'm going to be true to it. I'm sorry. Thanks, but no thanks. And when Hugh B is in the first presidency in 1960, he writes a book about marriage that's based on his temple consolations and his counseling married couples. And in this book, you read his own family in such profound intensity. And there's one moment in there where Hugh B talks about divorce. And he said, a man who abandons his family will pay the ultimate price in the next life. And he's talking about Rowland abandoning his daughter Zola. It's such a tragic story. He goes on to marry more women, Rowland, And Hugh B, in the meantime, in the 1930s, is asked by his mission president, Heber J. Grant, the church president by this point, to write a law that will criminalize polygamy, to make it a felony. And so Hugh B does as he's told, as he always does, writes the law, submits it to a state lawmaker to then begin the discussions of getting it ratified. And in 1944, this is 3 years after their divorce, in 1944, federal or state authorities, in conjunction with the leadership of the church, they arrest a whole slew of polygamists, including Rule and Jess. And Rule and Jess will go to prison for a short period. And the person who sent them there was the law that his former father-in-law did.
So, Matt, and we've talked about this a little bit already today, but in Second Class Saints, of course, you talk about Brown pressing for years for the church to lift its racist priesthood temple ban. He dies several years before it happened. How close did he come to succeeding before he actually died?
Of lifting the ban?
Yeah, getting the church to lift the ban.
Well, in 1969, close. In 1969, Hugh B. Brown was on the outs with the church president, as I referred to a minute ago, over leadership issues. And David O. McKay was 95 at this point, about ready to turn 96. And Sterling McMurrin, one of Hugh B's close friends, a liberal philosophy professor at the University of Utah, also a good friend of David O. McKay's. Also a good friend of David O. McKay's sons, Lawrence and Edward McKay. Sterling McMurrin goes to Hugh B and he says, we got to lift this ban before the president dies. Can you help? And Hugh B's response is, what do you think I've been doing the last 5 years? And I've gotten my knuckles wrapped for it. I'm not in a position to help. I'm on the outs. And so they agree that it ought to be the McKay sons to help push this forward. And that's what they do. And they convince President McKay, who's just really confined to the Hotel Utah, his apartment. He can no longer go into the church office building. And by the way, at this point, his health is so frail. This is September of 1969. His health is frail. In October, he'll have a stroke. So that tells you where we're at. But they convince President McKay that it's a policy and not a doctrine. And why that's significant is that if it's a policy, that it can be lifted, the ban, with an administrative fiat or just a decision from the president, as opposed to a full-fledged revelation where each of the 12 have to consent. And so anyway, they do convince him to do it. They identify a man named Monroe Fleming at the Hotel Utah, African-American man who'd worked there for 26 years as a waiter in other capacities, got to know the brethren well, always bore his testimony to the missionaries who came in the old language training center back in the day. The brethren, at least the ones that he interacted with, loved him. Anyway, so they had him in mind to ordain him to the Melchizedek priesthood. And when the McKay sons had made that pitch to the president, Alvin Dyer, an additional counselor in the first presidency, was there, a man with some very strong views about the ban. When he learned what the McKay sons were doing, he went back to Harold Lee, who was in the hospital, and he said, this is what they're doing. You got to intervene. So Harold Lee, who at that point was third in line for the church presidency, who was 74 at that point, he was looked upon as who'd be the next church president, or at least he would have the longevity that President McKay had. Turns out that wasn't the case, but that was the expectation, because Joseph Fielding Smith, who was in his 90s, wouldn't be around very long after President McKay died. So anyway, calls in Elder Lee to put a stop to it. Elder Lee puts a stop to it, and Hugh B is absolutely crushed. And Spencer Kimball, the church president, who would go on to be the church president, was supportive of ordaining Monroe Fleming at the time. And when Hugh B died in December of 1975, Spencer Kimball, one of the last things that Hugh B did was he told Spencer Kimball, the new church president, he said, promise me you'll lift this ban. And Kimball said he would. And in 1978, Hugh B would have been dead for 3 years at this point. The ban's lifted. President Kimball announces a revelation. And the Brown children write in their diaries that one of them writes that Daddy is on cloud 9 jumping around. I mean, there's very vivid, language about how the ban would have affected their father. And the brethren knew that the ban was so important to Hugh B that James Faust, who was an apostle at the time, Also, and Eldon Tanner, who was in the first presidency at the time, also the nephew to Hugh B. Brown, and then Gordon Hinckley, who was close to Hugh B. Brown. They all called members of the Brown family and tearfully explained that the ban had been lifted, the rumors that you had heard are true, and your father and grandfather would have loved to have heard or seen this day. So they attributed the lifting of the ban to Brown. And I'll just say one last thing, that one of the Brown daughters, she said that the holdup to lifting the ban was Harold Lee. And she wrote, who died in 1978, that Harold Lee is now dead, and hopefully God will be merciful towards him for holding up my father and his life's work. And she viewed her father's life's work as lifting the ban.
So you mentioned already, but how did he feel about being dropped from the first presidency?
It's it's a bitter thing, Peggy. He's bitter. And he's typically Latter-day Saints are not supposed to aspire to positions. They're not supposed to show bitterness or anger. It's just what God wants, right? The truth is, the brethren are human. And when Hugh B is unceremoniously dropped to the point where they don't even acknowledge his contribution and service at the April 1970 conference, it just rubs it in the wound. And the dad, another layer of complexity, the person that orchestrated his removal was his one-time close friend, Harold Lee. So it was particularly acute. And Mary Brown Firmage, Hugh B's daughter, tells this wonderful story about in April of 1970, when Hugh B didn't even want to go to the conference. He was so bitter, and he had health issues too, but more than that, he was just bitter, didn't want to show his face. And he was looking for ways to get out of the conference. And those around him said, you got to go. Anyway, Zina, his wife, had a stroke and was bedridden, so she wasn't mobile. Anyway, Mary came home one day in April of 1970, and she said, Daddy, Mommy, I did something that for which you'll be proud. And what'd you do? She said, I paid a courtesy call to the new first presidency. I went to see Eldon. That's what they called President Tanner, their relative. I went to see Eldon. He wasn't in. But I did see Joseph Fielding Smith, the new president, and I tried to congratulate him, and he just looked at me glassy-eyed. And I tried to break the silence and say, your father, Joseph F. Smith, married my parents 60 plus years ago. Trying to make conversation. But Joseph Fielding Smith and Hugh were never close. And according to Mary, Joseph Fielding Smith was not even really that cordial. And then she goes to the first counselor, Harold Lee, next. And she says, I want to congratulate you on this new assignment. And Harold Lee gives her a big hug. They had a close relationship, he and Mary. Gave her a big hug. And Mary says to Harold Lee, remember what I told you years ago. Be humble, remain humble. And so they hugged it out. She goes back to tell her parents, I paid a courtesy call on your behalf because I knew that you couldn't do it. And Zina Brown, lying in her bed in her living room in Salt Lake, she says, bless you, darling, bless you. And the Browns are they were proper people. Even if you have bitterness or differences, it's the right thing to do to pay that courtesy call. And the fact that Hugh and Zina couldn't do it, and the fact that their daughter acted as a surrogate, meant the world to Hugh and Zina.
So how did Hugh become such a champion of liberals at BYU and elsewhere?
Well, he was a Democrat. And when he first came to the United States in the 1930s, this is really a comical story. He's asking everybody he knows, including his mission president, Heber J. Grant, should I be a Republican or Democrat? And this is the kind of thought behind this, right? And depending on who we talk to, Anthony Ivins, and at the time, Heber J. Grant, who later changed, by the way, but he was a Democrat at the time, and they told him, be a Democrat. And some of the Republicans said, I'll be a Republican. And so Hugh sides with the Democrats. And what happens is that he's a New Deal Democrat, which means that he's a New Deal liberal, I should say. Liberalism means something different without going into the details here. But it means something different by the 1930s. And simply put, in the 1930s, it means that the government ought to intervene in the economy to level the playing field. That's what a New Deal liberal looks like in the 1930s. Much different from liberalism, or what we call classical liberalism in the 1800s. By the 1960s, the Democratic Party and its conception of liberalism will evolve, and Hugh will evolve too. What that means is that liberalism is no longer just the government intervening into the economy, it's also the government intervening into the lives to bless racial minorities. And Hugh will be caught up in this what liberalism means. And by the 1950s and definitely the 60s, Hugh starts to really push the church, not just to end the priesthood and temple ban, but also to accord civil rights to African Americans. And some of the brethren, they're just as opposed to civil rights as they were the ban.
So why couldn't he succeed with on behalf of Lel Benyan?
Well, Lel Benyan is a beloved institute teacher at the University of Utah. He started teaching there, I think, in 1934, and he was a very brilliant speaker. His work is not in his writing. He's not one of those guys that we talk about his writings today. He was a beloved teacher. That's his forte. Influenced thousands of Latter-day Saints, including Pulitzer Prize-winning author Laura Thatcher Ulrich, who called her time in his class back in the 50s a defining moment in her life. Lel Benyan had always expressed his concerns about the priesthood ban to President McKay as early as 1943, when McKay was in the first presidency. And President McKay always gave him the latitude to speak openly about this. I mean, can you imagine this today? An institute person going into the church, member of the first presidency, and says, I don't believe in this major important part of the church's teachings. Can I still keep my job? And President McKay was okay with it. And as long as, Lowell, I'm sure, didn't broadcast his views publicly. Well, the problem is he did. And it gets back to the brethren. I've written about this in great detail in Second Class Saints. Gets back to the brethren that he's telling his institute students, and also he's giving firesides, and he's saying that the ban's immoral. And there are a number of people who went to bat for him, including Hugh B. Brown, who said, look, this guy's he's a good man. The students love him. They need him. The church needs him. Well, by 1961, people like Hugh B. Brown and others had gone to bat for him, protecting him for too many times at this point. And Joseph Fielding Smith and some of the hardliners decided that there's nothing in the world that's going to stop you from protecting him this time. He needs to go. And so by 1961, Joseph Fielding Smith and a guy named Boyd Packer, who was an assistant to the Quorum of the 12 at the time, they lead this effort to oust him. And Ernest Wilkinson's usually the person that he's the fall guy. It's Wilkinson that fired him. Not so, not true at all. Wilkinson fired him on paper, but he was just following orders. But it was Joseph Fielding Smith that orchestrated it, and Hugh B. didn't have the power at that point to save his friend.
So I'm going to take a swing at this next question, Matt, and see, because it's less historical, sort of more also current history. But I kind of want to get a historian's take. When I read and hear about this arc of Hugh B. Brown's life story, I can't help but see some similarities in today's leadership. Let's take Dieter Uchtdorf, for example. If not in particulars of his life story, at least in some basics, sort of a man in several countries, first of all, a popular speaker, a beloved, perceived as progressive, dropped from the first presidency rather abruptly. What do you think of that comparison?
Yeah, so the way I want to answer this question is probably this way, and that is there's a public perception and a private perception, right? The public perception is Hugh B. Brown was ill and he could no longer function in his calling. Well, that's true. President Brown was just diagnosed with Parkinson's disease right around the time he was dropped from the first presidency. But my response to that is that's never stopped any of the brethren in the past from, so that's not credible, right? That they have health issues. If that were the case, they'd all be released, right? They're older men. They're just, they succumb to the burdens of frail human life, right? So that's the public perception. He was dropped because of his health. That's not true. He was an activist. That's what did it. The priesthood ban was one thing, but there were some other things that got President Brown in trouble. Uchtdorf, the public line, as I recall, was that we want to prepare President Oakes to be the next church president. And there is some truth to that. I mean, when David O. McKay put Joseph Fielding Smith into the first presidency in the fall of 1965. That's one of the things he said. I mean, Joseph Fielding Smith at that point was 91 years of age. I mean, he's not going to be globetrotting, organizing stakes over in Europe or anywhere else. And so, but if he's going to run the church when I pass, he needs to see how it works. So there is some truth to that. But the truth is with Uchtdorf, and I'm speculating, that he was saying things that, and he was too beloved, he was too liberal, that was too much for some of the brethren. And he had given some very high-profile addresses in the Salt Lake Valley after Elder Packer had talked about LGBTQ issues. I think one sermon that Elder Packer gave was that a loving God would never make somebody that way. In other words, he's implying that you choose to be gay. And President Uchtdorf went around the valley after that, contradicting what he was saying. And then it wasn't too far after that, it made the news, and you see President Uchtdorf pushing Elder Packer's wheelchair. I thought, what a public op that is. Anyway, so I think that also the last thing I'll say on that is that President Nelson, this is how it works, built on relationships. He was not close to Uchtdorf. And he recognized in Oaks, they came into the quorum roughly about the same time, back in, 84? And so they came up into leadership together. They were close. Obviously, Oaks has a legal mind, felt that the church needed those legal issues at the highest quorum, the highest level. Uchtdorf didn't provide that. And so I'm speculating, I don't know President Uchtdorf, but I've heard anecdotally, for whatever it's worth, that he was bitter when he got dropped and he wasn't happy, because once you're at the highest quorum and you have this level of importance, I don't mean just because of your ego. You can really see the good that you can do in your position of leadership. I'm certain that must have just weighed on him, that he would lose that kind of influence at the highest level. And he still has influence as a member of the Quorum of the 12. But let's not kid ourselves. It's not the same level of influence that one gets in the highest quorum of the church. And that's exactly what happened with Hugh B. Brown. He's the guy making the decisions of the church. As I used the analogy a minute ago, driving the car. You're no longer driving the car if you're at the Quorum of the 12. You're just one of 12 voices. And I'm sure Uchtdorf had that very human response of being pushed aside in favor of somebody new.
Okay, so last question. What do you think Hugh B. Brown's legacy in the church is, or do people even know of him, really?
Yeah, older generations do, certainly. I mean, the people that I share my work with, it's Hugh B. Brown, the liberal apostle. I love him, and there's a story told of Hugh B. Brown in the 1970s. This is after Dialogue, this very liberal Mormon journal, was created. And he loved to have Dialogue open on his desk at his office at church headquarters. And he wanted people to see him reading Dialogue. And he would sometimes tell people, he said, I read this more than I read the Ensign. And he's bragging about this. And the brethren, of course, think that Dialogue's subversive. So that's certainly one of his legacies, Peggy, is that he's the liberal apostle. And it wasn't just that he was liberal, he courted it. He told the saints, and just one example, in a BYU devotional address in 1961, just after he was put into as a member of the First Presidency, he told the faculty, he said, you've got concerns, bring them to me. I mean, he's asking for this. And the context, of course, is critical because there's this really, really hardcore conservative president. And he's basically saying, you don't like him? Tell me. I'll fight your fights for you. And so the liberals love him for that. And he's so open and tolerant. He also, of course, racial equality, both with the priesthood and temple ban, as I noted, with civil rights. I mean, it's just unheard of because the church is really touting these racial teachings that are so fundamentally at odds to racial equality. And so he's also pushing back that in order to be a good Latter-day Saint, you have to be a Republican or a Bircher. And I think we can't lose the significance of that moment because Elder Benson was such a powerful voice and had such a massive following. And President Brown had this ecumenical vision that was not shared by Elder Benson. And the vision is this: you can't globalize the church. You can't spread the gospel if you're demonizing Northern European countries and calling them socialist and communist. That's bad for business. You can't bring the gospel to sub-Saharan Africa if you're calling Dr. King a communist. That's bad for business. And so he has this vision of what it means to globalize and to universalize the gospel message. And just to be clear, I want to be fair here to Elder Benson. Elder Benson will come around to this vision by the late 1980s, or at least the mid to late 1980s, where he's not calling Dr. King a communist any longer. He's not saying that people from Denmark are communists, none of that nonsense. And I'd like to think that he had learned his lesson and sort of recognized what the church could become, the potential, if you backed off some of this incendiary rhetoric. And the last thing that I would say to Peggy to this about his liberal views is that I think that he's given a younger generation of Latter-day Saints a vision about what the gospel can look like, that you can actually really care about poverty and immigrants. These are things that he talked about, by the way. In the 1960s, he talked about immigration. He was alive during the Immigration Act of 1965 that would break down immigrant barriers. He was alive during, of course, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs, advancing a war on poverty. And so Brown's talking about all of this stuff, and he's working with liberals both in the church and out of the church to make it a reality. The sad part is that he wasn't blessed with longevity. Well, he was 90, I guess, but he didn't outlive Benson. And so it was Elder Benson's vision that held sway over his. And we're still seeing that vision today with certain Latter-day Saints who embrace some of these far out theories.
So, Matthew Harris, we are so excited about this book. Can't wait to read it. Thanks for joining us today.
It was a pleasure.
Thanks to Dave Noyce.
Always a pleasure. And go Cubs.
And to our producer, Chris Samuels. We remind our listeners they can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.